Bow-do-do-do-do. Bow-do-do-do-do. Bow-do-do-do-do-do-do. 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 Oh my god, hey! Oh gosh, that's actually much more intimidating than it looks. Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is Mickey Jo, and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional theatre reviewer and a stagey content creator here on YouTube. And this very evening, I was invited to the New Victoria Theatre in Woking to go and see the relatively new UK tour of the musical adaptation of Pretty Woman. Now, I've actually seen this show twice before. This was a short-lived Broadway musical that had much more success with audiences once it crossed the pond and came to London. It initially opened at the Piccadilly Theatre, where Moulin Rouge now is, in the West End. It subsequently moved to the Savoy, which is where I saw it twice. But on neither of those occasions did I actually make a full YouTube review of the show. So today we're going to be talking about the tour. We're going to be talking about the new cast, led by Amber Davies, Oduba, Oliver Savile, and Natalie Paris. But we are also going to be talking about the show and its material. Is this what I would call a good musical, and do I enjoy it and have a nice time when I go and see it? And the answers to those two questions may seem contradictory, and they may surprise you. Stay tuned to find out why. Now, if you enjoy this, I've still got this here. I don't need this. Hello, tiny people in my camera. Anyway, if you enjoy this video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming very soon. More touring shows, West End shows, Broadway shows, also Christmas shows, 'tis the season and whatnot. So make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any more of that theatre-themed content. For more of my opinions about shows, you can also go and find me on other social media platforms. I am on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, and I'm on the app formerly known as Twitter, at MickeyJoTheatre. Go and follow me on those. For now, while we're here, let's talk all about Pretty Woman, the musical. Now, it's at this point normally in my reviews that I would explain the context of the musical and what it's based on. I'm assuming we all know what Pretty Woman is, right? I couldn't tell you the year that this film came out. Let's Google this together. 1990. There you go. It's 5 years older than me. Pretty Woman is a musical based on the 1990 film starring Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. He is a ruthless and emotionless businessman who finds himself in Hollywood as part of a business deal where he's doing business. It's very Sam the Eagle from The Muppets Christmas Carol. That's a niche reference, but sound off if you got that one in the comments section. Business. And through a nifty little plot justification about him not being able to drive the car that he finds himself in order to get to his hotel, he has to stop and ask for directions and help from a prostitute working on Hollywood Boulevard, whose name is Vivian. She is the protagonist of this story and the titular Pretty Woman. It's also one of the roles that catapulted Julia Roberts to megastardom. When he nearly slammed a jewellery box shut on her hand, it was the laugh heard round the world. Now, Edward, nearly forgot his name then, it barely matters. He is a man who is used to getting what he wants, and so he first pays her to escort him to his hotel so he can actually get there and get the car there in one piece. She sticks around. She expects to be paid for an hour of her time to do her kind of a business transaction, and he decides that he's a man who doesn't like to be rushed. He wants to get on with his work, so he decides to pay her initially for the night and then ultimately for a week of her time. During which time we kind of have this My Fair Lady type of a situation where he exposes her to a different kind of life. And though she initially behaves in a way that is indicative of the fact that she is not accustomed to this kind of a lifestyle, it's her charm that shines through and wins him over and melts his frozen heart. Now, the musical version of all of this opened on Broadway in the summer of 2018, directed and choreographed by Jerry Mitchell of Legally Blonde and Hairspray fame. It features an adapted book by Gary Marshall and J.F. Lawton, the rights of the original screenplay, and it features music and lyrics by Canadian pop superstar Bryan Adams and his writing partner Jim Vallance. But it wasn't hugely well received on Broadway. Any show that opens in the summer in New York kind of anticipates that it is not going to be a huge critical success. It doesn't expect to win many Tony Awards because because that's just about the worst time you could open in terms of Tony Awards buzz and momentum. However, when the show came to London, albeit with a pandemic in the middle, it seemed to prove a little bit more popular with audiences. And if anyone wants my 2 cents as to why this is, I actually think comparing the two crowds, that the London musical theatre audiences are much more commercially driven right now than those in New York. Unless something is hugely critically prestigious and very artsy, like the Cabaret revival, which is still a well-known name of a show, it's very hard to sell tickets unless it has a huge megawatt star in it, or it has an obvious title based on a film, which is why Mrs. Doubtfire the musical is now doing well. Back to the Future, still running in London as well. And there will always be a place in the West End for a very obviously romantic musical with a lot of red in its marketing. Now, this success explains why it is now currently on a UK tour, which it embarked on relatively recently, and I'm going to tell you what I thought of the touring production and of the show itself right now. So here are my thoughts on Pretty Woman as a musical. When I first saw this, I had been putting it off for some time, and I saw a performance at West End Live that had me intrigued, but I still went in with incredibly low expectations because I'd heard it was very disappointing. I had not heard good things about this show whatsoever. I would say I went in with ground floor level expectations. That's floor 1 to you Americans watching this video. And because of that, I was actually a little bit charmed by it. I enjoyed myself. Now, I think this is a show that entirely sinks or swims based on the strength of the actress playing Vivian and whether or not she is charismatic and endearing and makes you, the audience, fall in love with her. That is crucial, ultimately, to your enjoyment of this show. And both times I saw it in London, I saw the wonderful Ellie J, who was a swing on that production and understudying the role of Vivian Ward. She's also understudying Vivian and Kit DeLuca, I believe, on the tour, as well as playing the role of Vivian at certain tour dates. If you see her, you will be very lucky. Because I thought she was astonishing and deeply charming, and that made me charmed by the show. Which is not to say that I think it's a well-written musical, but I'm going to cover that in more detail in the next section. Let me just address why it's easy for me to enjoy this show. It's a charming storyline. I made that My Fair Lady comparison already. It's a storyline that we have seen played out in musicals, and it works on stage. This kind of an initially icy, slightly confrontational romance where they melt into a deeper love for each other. It's very Curly and Laurie in Oklahoma. Going back even further, it's very Beatrice and Benedict in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. And they do the romance of it very well because the film does the romance of it very well. It's iconic for a reason. And the show, pretty faithfully, occasionally too faithfully, hits all of those same romantic beats. It delivers the sensuality and the passion of it very well. There are moments in this where I find myself thinking, I don't know if we really ought to be rooting for these characters, because I think in any other rom-com, if this story were to be written today, you would get up to the point where he has paid her for her time that first evening and he wouldn't consummate the transaction because he would say he doesn't want to use her. I don't know if you could still deliver this story in the same way today, but because this is being viewed through a nostalgic lens to the first film, we don't mind that for that entire week he is still paying her for sex, objectively. And I mean, hey, she's on board with it. She negotiated the terms. She says when, she says who, she says how much. I was paying attention. Another thing the show does very well is it combines a few different characters into this one kind of narrator figure. The character of Mr. Thompson, who is the hotel manager at the Beverly Wiltshire, where Edward is staying with Vivian in the penthouse. But we first meet him on the streets of Hollywood as a character called Happy Man. He also pops up in various other places. At one point he pops up in the orchestra pit, which is very novel. But his actually ends up being one of the best roles in the show. He holds our hand as the audience and guides us through this story. The story that is not a convoluted one, but it's just a way of theatricalizing the material a little bit, which is beneficial. Anytime you take a film and put it on stage, theatricalizing it and actually leaning into your capabilities as a musical is always going to be beneficial. Now, these are all general notes about the show. If you want to know a little bit more about this touring production, let me tell you about some of the differences between the version I saw at the Savoy and this one. So they had this walkway that came out across the front of the stage and little lift in the middle that they used a few times. That obviously is not a feature of the touring set because they're visiting a lot of different theatres with a lot of different capabilities, so there is now no lift moment. The most consequential moment where that was used, I think, was her entrance in the red dress before they go to the opera. She now just walks on, which I don't hate, honestly. Something in terms of the music at that moment still isn't quite right with the reveal of that anyway, but I think I maybe even liked it better with her walking on rather than her coming up in the lift. Because if it isn't going to be scored with some kind of lush romantic sweep, then better for her to just stroll on rather than be lifted up and suggest that there ought to be that same uplifting feel in the music that isn't really there. There is also no track scenery. Things get kind of pushed on and off by members of the ensemble, and we have a fewer set pieces in most instances. They will only bring on the hotel set pieces they really need in each scene. If she's not going to walk over to the wardrobe and put something in it, then there's no wardrobe there. They just bring on the bed if they're only going to use the bed. And there's also no bathtub. Now, another iconic scene from the film, Julia Roberts in the bathtub, listening to music through the headphones, singing along to it, having a lovely time. They did used to recreate this in the show as well, but they don't have the bathtub set for the tour, so instead Vivian just enters from where the bathroom is suggested to be, wearing a robe and singing along obnoxiously to the Walkman. Now, the fact that she is still surprised by Edward when she walks back into the room where she left him moments ago after having had a bath, that's a little bit inexplicable, but, you know, it's hard to tour a bathtub, I guess. That and her trying to get out of the bathtub and dress herself without revealing too much to the audience always made me a little bit nervous. So it's definitely a sparser set. It's the touring version of a set. It doesn't look as radically cheaper as a lot of shows become when they go out on tour versus when they're in the West End, and I don't think this is a show for which it really matters, because its problems have never been its set. So I told you, I enjoy this show, I'm charmed by this show, it hits the same beats as the film, and people who love the film will probably be very happy with it. Let me now tell you about why it also kinda sucks. So what we have to remember here is that audiences aren't going to go and see something replicated exactly when they could just watch the film at home, but they will go and see a musical version of it because that is something different. They do, however, still expect all of the same iconic visuals. They expect a certain amount of familiarity in the performances, so performers and creative teams don't have complete license to reinvent these characters or, sadly, really cast them in a way that would allow a wider variety of performers to take on these roles, and more to the point, they're expecting to see particular iconic scenes and hear iconic lines. Now, knowing this, when you are creating a musical version of this film, you might think that the best thing to do is just to keep those moments intact and not do anything to them because they're so iconic, but that would be a big mistake. Big! Huge. Which, funnily enough, is exactly the moment I'm talking about. So, in the film, Vivian goes to buy a new outfit as suggested to her by Edward. He's given her his credit card, but the snooty shop ladies refuse to wait on her in the Rodeo Drive store where she finds herself. So she leaves, and eventually when Edward takes her elsewhere, she makes a point of going back to the store, newly attired. They don't even recognize her, but she points out that they work on commission, and in not serving her, they made a big mistake. Big. Huge. Now, a couple of moments ago, I said that audiences will go and see a musical version of an iconic film because it musicalizes it. They don't want to see exactly the same thing because it will invite comparison. And if they love this film, they can picture and hear exactly how Julia Roberts says this line, and they are never going to be able to exactly replicate it. The same for shows like Mrs. Doubtfire, and the same for shows like Dirty Dancing. When you're just trying to imitate, you are playing a losing game, and I don't think it's what the audience really want. However, you have other capabilities because you are a musical, and they are also expecting to hear great songs. So what would be more impactful than just recreating this iconic scene and not quite doing it as well would be to musicalize this moment. Now, this moment comes in the middle of another song called You're Beautiful, where Edward has taken her to this other store and got the staff to all treat her very nicely. But the thing that makes the most sense to me is for this to be part of the song and for her to sing and belt out the words, big mistake, big, huge, even if it was just the word huge and that lent back into the song, and she did some like big belty note on huge, and then you see them melt away to the sides as she's like stretching out with the bags and she's like fully coming into her power because it's, you know, her emerging and her beginning to change at the end of Act 1. I'm not sure what this end of Act 1 is meant to suggest because the direction doesn't really clarify why we're pausing the story at that moment. And if there was a little bit more clarity in the direction there from Jerry Mitchell, it could feel like a Diana the Musical end of Act 1. Not to use that as a beacon of creative genius, but at least you know why it's the end of Act 1, because she's gone on a little bit of a journey, and at the end of Act 1 she is just beginning to discover the extents of her own powers and what she can achieve by herself, and she's coming into her own, and her confidence is beginning to emerge. That same thing could be happening here if it was staged a little bit more clearly. But then that same scene also fails from the off because of the song that comes before it, one of the weaker songs in the score, Rodeo Drive. Now, I like a lot of the songs of this score, but Rodeo Drive is not the one. This is sung by Vivian's friend, another sex worker by the name of Kit DeLuca, and it's a song in which she tells Vivian that Rodeo Drive is the place she needs to go to buy the fancy dresses. And the whole vibe of this song is basically just like, yeah, it's Rodeo Drive, it's hot, look at all these dresses, and you have the female ensemble doing runway poses in these great outfits. If it were to be lyrically and in terms of the feel of the music just a little bit more aspirational and dreamy and really build her up to experience all of this in a way that was a little bit more earnest, then when she gets completely dismissed, it would feel sadder, it would feel more heartbreaking. And this moment gets referred to a lot because she goes back to the hotel and Mr. Thompson helps her out for the first time. We see the beginnings of a friendship there, and we come to learn a little bit more about his character because he gets her address from elsewhere. It's also then important when Edward takes her shopping to another store because she's incredibly reluctant to go back to Rodeo Drive because of this first experience. We need it to be built up as this aspirational thing for her to be a little bit more crushed by it. Now, that is not the only filler song in this score. There is a moment in the second act where no one else really has any of the thrust of the plot. It is only about Vivian and Edward, but we have to cut back away to our supporting characters just so the second half isn't exclusively on the two of them the whole time. So you have this song between Happy Man on Hollywood Boulevard and Kit DeLuca singing about their dreams, singing a song called Never Give Up on a Dream. It's an utterly pointless song. There is no reason for it in the narrative, and it's not a good enough song to justify its presence, unfortunately. Some other random issues that I have with this score, sorry Bryan Adams, when they're at is it the polo match or the polo club? I don't know things about polo, I'm not Mickey Joe Sports. Now, it's meant to be an uncomfortable scene, but it's just the most awkward polo club in the world because there's no underscoring, and I don't remember this from when I saw it previously, but it was so silent tonight. When Edward's lawyer, Mr. Phil, whatever his name is, goes over and speaks to Vivian, having just found out that she's a sex worker and is completely misogynistic and rude to her. But you have all these other people having conversations on stage, and there is no underscoring whatsoever in the music. There is no background noise of conversation. It's just deathly silent as they're all staring at each other at the world's most uncomfortable polo club. Another iconic scene happens when they go to the opera. Let me try this again. Woohoo! There you go. They're watching along. Edward is charmed by Vivian being enthralled by her first trip to the opera, and you have this lovely operatic moment sung beautifully by the two ensemble members who have beautiful operatic voices. We learn that as an audience in that moment. But what gives me a little bit of theatrical whiplash every time is that we cut away from this opera sequence to these soft rock interludes that Edward is singing. This one I think is called You and I just wish the transition out of the opera into his music was a little cleverer. When he is singing at the end and they're dancing around together and you have the soprano singing operatically over the top, that's clever. But the first blend into him singing is not. It's like a car crash. I mentioned Anywhere But Here. That's kind of Vivian's I Want song. We see her initially being frustrated with being on Hollywood Boulevard. She doesn't love this life for herself. The song I like, the way that the book introduces the song, is a great example of what's wrong with this book, because it's such an easily fixed problem. Gosh, this needed a dramaturg's intervention. So like I said, it's an I Want song for Vivian, and she's basically singing about how she would rather be anywhere but here. The way that this gets set up is she is talking to Kit about like wanting to go somewhere else, and Kit says to her, more or less, where would you go? And she then answers that question by beginning to sing, except the way this is directed is Kit says to her, where would you go? Asks a question and then immediately turns around so she can be facing upstage and Vivian can sing a solo forwards. And that's just nonsense to me, because you don't have conversations like that. You don't say, I'm going to ask you a question and then immediately turn my back on you so you can sing your response. And what would be so much easier is if you were to keep the rest of the dialogue the same and just change Kit's line to, it's not like we have anywhere else to go, and then she she can leave. That's a line you leave on. That's like a, well, this is it, isn't it? And then Vivian's going to turn to the audience and has the impetus theatrically to say, you know what? No, this is not it. I would rather be anywhere but here. It doesn't have to be the world's most obvious setup that doesn't make sense conversationally. I'm mad about this. And yet, like I told you, I keep going back to this show. This is my third time. I don't know how many more times I will go back and see this show because, you know, my initial low expectations and its charm can only carry me through so many repeat viewings when I do get frustrated by the shortcomings of the material. But one of the big reasons I went back this time was to see the new tour cast. So let me tell you about the make or break performances. Now, right off the bat, I'm not going to be able to tell you anything about Oduba's performance as Happy Man / Mr. Thompson because he was not there at the press night performance that I was at, and we had the understudy Curtis Patrick instead, who did a fantastic job. I warmed to his characterization of Mr. Thompson. I wasn't wholly convinced by his Happy Man, but he was a very endearing Mr. Thompson, and that character's friendship with Vivian comes to be one of my favourite things about this show. I will say, this is one of those roles that's really hard to do as an understudy because you have to take instant and total ownership of the stage, but he played it very charmingly, he danced it beautifully, and I thought he did a wonderful job. Let's move on to our leading lady, Amber Davies as Vivian Ward. Now, I've seen Amber in kind of the last three major musical theatre roles that she's done. I saw her in Back to the Future and 9 to 5 and Bring It On. And this is the kind of show that really works for her, because she does have this slightly uptight quality. That sounds insulting, and it's not a bad thing. But when I saw her in Bring It On, even though she looked like she was having a lot of fun on stage and she was really giving it her all, like she is committed wholly to every musical theatre role I've ever seen her perform, I thought tonally she didn't quite make sense for high school based material. But this role really works for her. That same slightly cold quality makes a lot of sense for her Vivian at the beginning of the show when she is indignant about her surroundings and she's completely over it and she's singing Anywhere But Here and she is getting annoyed by people bumping into her on Hollywood Boulevard and she's just completely done. What I will say is when we then have the flirtation with Edward, she's clearly faking it and she's clearly like putting on this persona, but I think there's still room for her to have a little bit more fun with it. She could be a little bit more playful and not quite as aggressive. What she does have is a wonderful understanding of the show's tone. She lands all of the comedy moments. She understands the way that this script works and the beats that we need to get. The relationship between her and Edward, played by Oliver Savile, is pitched perfectly. You believe it utterly. There's such a great power dynamic between the two, so you don't feel as though she's being taken advantage of in this situation. She holds her own against him. She is as endearing, as charming, as likable, as warm as she needs to be for you to fall in love with her character, and by extension the show. That all rests on her performance. Her biggest vocal moment in this show is when she sings I Can't Go Back in the second act, probably again one of the strongest songs in the show's score. She does a fantastic job of singing that song. The only other shortcoming with her performance is you just tend to want a little bit more vulnerability. And there are moments in the second act where we find out a little bit more about her backstory, and she's playing sad. She's giving it the right emotions. You just don't necessarily feel that completely exposing kind of vulnerability, like she's fully let herself go with it. It also wouldn't hurt to see a little bit more genuine awe from her. Right at the end of the show, there's a moment where you just want her to be completely overwhelmed with joy, and you don't necessarily get that. Moving on to Oliver Savile as Edward. This, I think, is a really hard role to get right. And as weird as this is to say, he almost comes in too charming and too charismatic. I think we should be a little bit more against him in the beginning because his attitude and his behaviours have to change as a result of the time that he spends with Vivian. So I think if we're able to see a more pronounced change, he should be a little bit more standoffish, a little bit more abrupt. He's just playing impatient at the beginning, but he's still like cracking a very charming smile the entire time. But he is believably sophisticated. He's very suave. It's a great romantic rapport that the two of them have. He is quite playful in his flirtations with her. He is a great leading man. That's not an easy thing to get right. I enjoy his vocal delivery as well. Now, it's written for a little bit more of a rocky sound, and his voice is very strong. The range is fine. It's just that tonally it just starts to sound a little bit thinner towards his upper range. And some of the longer notes in songs like Freedom that you want him to bask in aren't quite basked in. I will quickly mention some other standouts within the cast. We had Ben Darcy as Philip Stuckey, probably my favourite actor I've seen in this role so far. I really hated him, which, you know, job well done there. Josh Damer Jennings and Lila Falche-Bass, I'm so sorry if I've mispronounced your names horribly, but beautiful operatic singing in the second act. Lovely, legit tone, delicious to listen to. And Noah Harrison, who plays a character named Julio, who is a bellhop at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Very charming, wonderful dancing, very much enjoyed his performance. He is one to watch. I've seen him in some other shows before. He's very talented. Now finally, we also have Six the Musical alumnus Natalie Paris, who is playing the role of Kit DeLuca. And I will say, she sounds phenomenal. Vocally, out of this world. Any show of the right kind of tone benefits hugely from having Natalie Paris singing its score. She is a vocal wizard. We know this to be true. That being said, this is not just a character who belts things occasionally and says lines to Vivian to allow her to then sing a song as she walks off inexplicably. This is also a comedy character, and unfortunately, Natalie just didn't really find the comedy. Like, the rhythm of the delivery was there. I just don't know if she lent all the way in with the commitment to it. Like, she's flying the plane, but she's not landing the jokes. And honestly, that's not a huge issue because it's not the most important factor of this show, but it's just another front on which the show can succeed and on which it can win you over as an audience, because that's what this show's good at doing. It's good at winning over audience members. If I can leave you with some thoughts on whether or not you should see this show, if you have any love for the movie, I think that you're going to enjoy this show. It pays homage beautifully. Like I said, it recreates it faithfully, possibly too faithfully, but very talented performers, a charming story, and in spite of myself, I have always enjoyed myself. So, if Pretty Woman the Musical sounds like something that you might enjoy, you can check it out this week at the New Victoria Theatre in Woking or on various other tour dates across the UK. Have a look at its tour dates and see if it's visiting a theatre near you. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope that you have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming very soon about all of your favourite shows. If you have seen Pretty Woman the Musical on tour already in the UK, comment down below with what you thought. And if you've seen any other version of the show previously, let us know what you thought about that as well. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!